Part 1. Freezing Nights and Canvas Tents? Native Americans found the answer.
Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere very cold. So before we begin, go ahead and dim the lights a little. Maybe pull a blanket over your shoulders. Get comfortable. Because for the next while, we're going to drift slowly through a very quiet, very snowy corner of North American history. Not the loud kind of history, not the battlefield kind, the slow kind, the kind that happens at night. The wind moving across the plains, a fire gently cracking inside a shelter, and people who, quite impressively, figured out how to survive winters that would make most of us immediately start Googling nearest heated hotel. Because here's the thing. When most Europeans first arrived in North America, they were, let's say, not fully prepared for the winter situation. They brought canvas tents, thin clothing, and a level of optimism that was honestly a little adorable. Unfortunately, optimism does not insulate very well, and winter on the Great Plains or in the northern forests has never been particularly impressed by optimism. Meanwhile, the Native American nations who had lived on this land for thousands of years had already solved most of these problems, quietly, efficiently, and often with a level of practicality that would make modern camping gear companies slightly nervous. So tonight, we're going to wander slowly through that world. The world of winter shelters, fires, furs, snow, wind, and the clever solutions that allowed entire communities to sleep peacefully while blizzards wandered around outside, doing their usual dramatic performance. And along the way, we'll meet a few different nations who each had their own methods of saying very calmly, "Winter? Yes, we've handled that."
Because many Plains nations, including groups like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche, followed the great buffalo herds across enormous distances, their homes had to move. And a teepee could be taken down in under an hour, packed onto a travois pulled by horses, and rebuilt later that same day somewhere else. Lightweight, warm, portable. Basically the luxury RV of the 18th century Plains. Meanwhile, the buffalo themselves provided more than just hides for walls. Their fur became robes and blankets, thick winter coats that wrapped around shoulders during long nights. Their meat fed families through the cold months. Nothing was wasted. And during the deepest parts of winter, communities often chose campsites carefully, near rivers that didn't freeze completely, in valleys that blocked the worst wind, sometimes tucked against small hills that acted like natural shields against storms. It wasn't random, it was experience. Hundreds of winters teaching people exactly where the wind would go and where it wouldn't. Now, if we drift northward from the plains and enter the forests around the Great Lakes, things begin to look a little different. Because forests bring a different set of problems. Snow becomes deeper. Trees block the wind but also trap cold air, and mobility becomes harder when everything is buried under several feet of white. So many nations in this region relied on a different shelter, the wigwam. Unlike the tall cone of the plains teepee, a wigwam was more rounded, built with flexible wooden saplings bent into a dome shape and covered with bark, mats, or hides. From the outside, it looked a bit like a large, sturdy, snow-resistant bubble, which, as it turns out, works extremely well when winter tries to sit on your roof for 3 months. The curved shape allowed snow to slide off instead of piling up and collapsing the structure. The walls were thick. The interior stayed surprisingly warm once a fire was burning. Inside, families slept on raised platforms covered with furs. The fire in the center provided heat and light, while smoke escaped from a small opening above.
And if the wind howled outside all night, which it often did, the structure simply absorbed it. No dramatic flapping, no midnight tent emergencies, just the quiet crackle of firewood and the steady breathing of people who had done this many times before. Of course, winter survival was not only about shelters. Clothing mattered just as much. Because stepping outside into a northern winter without the right clothing is a decision that tends to correct itself very quickly. Many Native American nations developed clothing systems that were perfectly adapted to their environments. Soft deerskin shirts and leggings provided flexibility and warmth. Buffalo robes added thick insulation. In the far north, among Arctic peoples like the Inuit, clothing became even more specialized. Caribou fur parkas, sealskin boots, multiple layers designed to trap body heat while still allowing movement during long hunts across frozen landscapes. Every material had a purpose. Fur turned inward for insulation. Fur turned outward to block wind and snow. It was a science, really, not written down in textbooks, but learned through centuries of living where winter was not a seasonal inconvenience, but a serious environmental event. And while European newcomers often struggled with frostbite, frozen supplies, and shelters that politely surrendered to the weather, native communities already understood something important. You don't fight winter, you work with it. You shape your homes around it. You choose materials that respect it. And you build fires in the center of structures designed, very calmly, to hold warmth like a quiet secret. So while blizzards wandered across the plains and forests, entire villages slept inside shelters that had been perfected long before the first canvas tent ever flapped nervously on the horizon. And in the next part of our story, we'll drift a little farther north, into deeper snow, where winter homes weren't just tents or domes, but something built directly from the snow itself, which, as it turns out, works extremely well when winter tries to sit on your roof for 3 months. Because sometimes the best way to survive winter is to build your house out of it.
Part 2. When the snow itself became the house. All right, let's gently continue our slow little journey north. The wind is still out there, doing what wind does best, wandering around with absolutely no concern for human comfort. Snow is still drifting across the landscape, piling up in quiet layers that look peaceful from a distance, and significantly less peaceful when you're trying to sleep in a badly designed shelter. And this is where things get interesting, because while people farther south were building teepees and wigwams, the communities living in the Arctic faced a completely different challenge. Their winters weren't just cold, they were deeply cold. Temperatures could fall to levels that would make even the most enthusiastic winter camper quietly reconsider their life choices. -30 degrees, -40, sometimes colder. Trees were scarce, firewood was rare, and the wind blowing across the open tundra had absolutely nothing in its way. Which means the people who lived there had to become very creative. Fortunately, they did. The Inuit and other Arctic peoples developed one of the most famous winter shelters in the world, the igloo. Now, if you grew up seeing cartoons, you may have the impression that an igloo is basically a small snow hut that looks cute, melts quickly, and is mostly used by cheerful penguins who serve hot cocoa. None of that is correct. First of all, penguins live in Antarctica. Second, igloos are surprisingly sophisticated structures. And perhaps most impressive of all, they are warm. Which sounds a little strange considering they are literally made of snow. But snow, as it turns out, is an excellent insulator.
When snow is packed together into blocks, tiny pockets of air become trapped inside it, and those little pockets of air help prevent heat from escaping too quickly. So when a skilled builder cuts blocks of compact snow and arranges them into a spiral dome, something interesting happens. The structure traps warmth. Inside the igloo, body heat from the people inside slowly raises the temperature. A small oil lamp, often fueled with seal fat, adds a bit more warmth. Outside, the air might be sitting at -40 degrees. Inside, the temperature could rise to around freezing, which might not sound cozy by modern living room standards, but compared to -40, it feels practically tropical. Building one of these structures required skill. The snow had to be the right consistency, not too soft, not too brittle. Builders used snow knives to cut large blocks, carefully stacking them in a rising spiral until the dome closed at the top. Then the inside walls were smoothed so melting wouldn't drip too much. A small entrance tunnel was dug slightly lower than the main chamber. That detail helped trap warm air inside while keeping cold air from rushing directly in. Simple idea, very clever result. And the igloo was not always a permanent home. For many Inuit hunters, it was a temporary shelter built during long hunting trips across the frozen sea ice. You might travel all day across the white landscape, tracking seals or caribou. The sun would dip low, the wind would start to sharpen, and rather than trying to sleep in the open, which would be a very short and uncomfortable experience, you would simply build a small igloo for the night, a shelter made from the very snow surrounding you, which is the kind of practical solution that tends to impress anyone who hears about it. Meanwhile, farther south, other native communities were solving winter problems in their own ways. Let's drift slowly toward the woodlands again, because forests bring their own advantages. Wood is everywhere, and wood means stronger structures.
Among many eastern woodland nations, including groups like the Haudenosaunee, often called the Iroquois, longhouses became the center of winter life. A longhouse was exactly what the name suggests, long, sometimes very long. These buildings could stretch over 100 feet, constructed from sturdy wooden frames covered with sheets of bark. Inside, multiple families lived together under one roof, arranged along the length of the structure. And at regular intervals, small fires burned down the center. Smoke drifted upward through holes in the roof. The fires provided warmth, light, and a place to cook meals during the long winter nights. Now imagine that scene for a moment. Outside, the forest is quiet under heavy snow. The wind rustles through bare branches. Animals move slowly through the cold. Inside the longhouse, there's warmth, fires glowing gently along the center aisle, people talking quietly, children sleeping beneath thick fur blankets, elders telling stories that have been passed down for generations. Winter wasn't just a season of survival, it was also a season of storytelling. When travel slowed and hunting trips were shorter, communities gathered inside these shelters and shared knowledge, legends, and memories. In many ways, winter became a classroom, the kind where the lessons were about history, animals, spirits, and the long experiences of the people who had lived on the land before. Meanwhile, European settlers arriving in these same regions often found themselves struggling. Early colonial records are filled with stories of difficult winters, houses that were poorly insulated, food supplies that ran low, clothing that wasn't quite suited for the climate. And again, we see moments where Native American knowledge quietly helped people survive.
Indigenous communities taught newcomers how to dress in layers of animal skin, how to insulate homes properly, how to store food for the cold months. They showed them which plants could still be found during winter. And sometimes, when settlements faced starvation or freezing conditions, native groups provided food and guidance that kept entire communities alive. It's a detail that sometimes gets overlooked in simplified versions of history. But the truth is that survival in North America's harsher climates often depended on knowledge that had been built over thousands of years. Knowledge about snow, wind, animals, shelter, fire. The small details that separate a miserable winter from a survivable one. And perhaps the most fascinating thing about all of this is how quiet the solutions were. There were no dramatic inventions, no sudden breakthroughs, just generations of observation, watching how snow drifted against hills, watching how animals survived the cold, testing materials, adjusting designs, until eventually entire cultures had developed systems of winter living that worked so well they barely needed explanation. A teepee facing the right direction, a wigwam with thick bark walls, a longhouse glowing with fires, an igloo carved neatly from the snow, each one different, each one perfectly suited to the place where it stood. And as we move gently forward in our story, we'll begin to see how these winter traditions shaped daily life, from hunting strategies to winter travel, and even the quiet rhythms of nights spent waiting out storms. Because winter in North America was never just about enduring the cold. It was about understanding it, living with it, and sometimes, very calmly, sleeping right through it.